5 brilliant ways to use white watercolour without getting in a big old muddy mess. That's what I'm going to share with you in this video. Welcome back to my channel. If we haven't met before, my name is Michelle, and on this channel you'll find all things watercolour, a little bit of mixed media techniques, some drawing, also a little bit of social media and business training for artists, so please do consider subscribing. If you click the bell notification, you'll get notified each time I have a new video for you. Just the very idea of using white watercolour can be a little bit controversial. In fact, I even tell beginners in my art classes not to go anywhere near it for very good reason. It can make a real mess of your paintings, but in this video I'm going to tell you not only 5 brilliant ways that you can use it very subtly and very carefully for specific techniques that are really going to look lovely, but I'm also going to tell you the 2 ways that you should never use white watercolour and explain to you how to keep it on your palette. In that way you won't get into trouble with it and you can take advantage of this wonderful paint. So the important thing with white paint is to understand exactly what it is and how it relates to your watercolours. So I've got here a lovely tube of Jackman's watercolour paint, and it's a white. Now people sometimes say what's best, white watercolour or gouache. It's the same thing. Now with white paint, all white is opaque. You can't get transparent white. You might think you've seen transparent white, but it's not fully white. So white is by nature opaque, and all watercolours are by nature transparent, and therein lies the problem. So what you're doing is when you're going into white paint, you're actually going into a separate medium. You're working in mixed media. Now this isn't a problem, but it can be very confusing for beginners. So you get your set of watercolours and there's a white in the corner, and you just assume that you use it the same as you use all the other watercolours and the same as you may have used other types of paints like acrylic. But the truth is, as soon as you go into white paint, you're going into mixed media, so you need to understand why you're doing it and how to use it properly. So before we move on, a quick word about how you should keep white in your watercolour palette. So I squeeze my tubes out into pans here. If you want to know how I set up my watercolour palettes, I've got a video for you which I will link to above, and you can watch that one later if you want to. But what I don't want you to do is to put your white watercolour out in your palettes like this. What I would like you to do is to keep it, if it's in a tube, keep it in a separate dish. It's a little bit lonely, isn't it, that tiny blob of white watercolour. I normally have a smaller dish than this and more paint out. I just put this little bit out the other day when I was using it. But I want you to keep it separately from your palettes, and if any white gets into your watercolour paints, I want you to clean up your palette before you make the next painting. A friend of mine called it a polluter. It's a bit harsh, isn't it? But I know what she means. It can just end up muddying up all of your watercolours. So what I want you to do is keep that white paint separate and then just use it as and when you need it without muddying up all of your palettes. So you'll understand a little bit more the problems that can happen with white paint if I tell you the first way that you shouldn't use your white paint. And this is the way that you probably think of using it first. It's most instinctive. If you're a beginner, you get a set of watercolour paints and there's a little white square in the corner. You're going to use that white paint to water down and to lighten your watercolour paints. But here's the problem. As we have mentioned, all white paint is opaque. Therefore, if you mix it into your watercolours, you're killing the transparency. It doesn't actually layer that easily either. So you're going to make your paintings look muddy and smeary, and it's not really a good way of using white paint. So in order, if you're a beginner, in order to lighten your watercolours, just add more water. Mixing in white paint in that way is not effective and will kill the transparency, and you'll lose that beautiful watercolour glow. We're going to move on in a minute and I'm going to show you effective ways of using the white, but I don't want you to use white paint in order to lighten your colours. Now the second way that is a really bad idea to use white paint, and this one really irritates me a little bit, almost as much as those sort of targeted Facebook ads that I get now that I'm over 50. Moving on. So this one really irritates me to see, and that's when somebody does a watercolour painting and then they block out the whites at the end with these blobs of white paint with white watercolour, white gouache, white acrylic. It's so noticeable. As I said earlier, white paint is opaque and it's matte. It doesn't reflect the light in the same way as watercolours. So if you look at your nice watercolour painting sort of side on, it catches the light. You have these lovely glowy watercolours, and the white is going to be so obvious that you've blobbed it on at the end. It's going to look a bit like Tipp-Ex, which I don't know if they have Tipp-Ex in America, but it's you know, the typewriter correction fluid, that really matte stuff that's supposed to blend in with your writing paper. That's what it's going to look like. It's going to look like you've Tipp-Exed. your little white highlights out, so I don't want to use it in that way either. So enough of all this doom and gloom. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at 5 brilliant ways that you can use white paint that will really add to and enhance your watercolour paintings. So the first use I discovered for white paint was a few years ago when I was painting a picture of our local water meadows with some cottages on. Now here in Suffolk in the UK we have lots of painted houses. They tend to be sort of brick and then rendered, and then they're painted with this kind of very matte chalky paint, and it didn't matter. I was trying to get a pink and it didn't matter. We have this famous Suffolk pink here. It didn't matter how much I mixed that watercolour, I wasn't getting that real feeling of the chalky paint, the solid chalky painted surface. So I'm going to point the camera downwards and I'll show you the difference and what I mean by that, and how it really helped me to get that painted house effect. So I'm going to show you the difference between painting with pure watercolour and then mixing the gouache in to get more of an opaque feel to your picture. So I'm going to use a sort of a light pinkish red here, and I'm going to layer it over this first little cottage I've drawn. I'm going over the windows because this is just a demonstration here. And I would normally possibly have masked those out in masking fluid. We'll go around the door though, why not? So there you can see how the pink paint looks. Now it's quite nice, and in a larger painting with lots of darks around, probably be perfectly okay. But as I said, it doesn't get that real sort of feeling of solidity and chalkiness. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to get my white paint here, and I'm going to mix some of that pink colour in. And you might at this point need a little bit more of the watercolour pigment. As I said, you want to make sure you clean your paints after doing this. Now I've got some sort of semi-opaque paint, and I'm going to paint that on like so. Now both with the white paint and without the white paint, you may find that you need to layer up a little more. In other words, you need to put more than one layer on before you do get that feeling of solidity. But hopefully you can see here the difference. I'll paint you a little swatch in a second as well. The difference, and how I've got a much more solid, chalky, matte, opaque colour. As I said, you don't want this throughout your whole painting, otherwise you lose the qualities of the watercolour. But when you've got these chalky sort of painted man-made objects that have actually been painted with this flat matte paint, it can really be quite useful. So I'll show you in a swatch. So here we've got with the white mixed in, and let's get a little bit of paint without, and then there you can see the paint without. So one shows the paper through and you'll get that lovely watercolour glow, and the other is quite matte and opaque. As I said, in places it can be useful. So the next use I discovered of white watercolour paint was to paint a flat background. Now I have I have tubes of gouache paint, so I have lots of different colours of this matte opaque paint, and if I want to, if I don't feel like having sort of realism, if I'm looking for sort of more of an illustrative thing, if I want a flat background behind my watercolour painting, behind a still life object or a flower for instance, I can use my gouache paint. But if I don't have a full set of gouache paints, I can just mix my white watercolour with one of my brightly coloured watercolours and make some gouache paint. Now all you do is you mix up a big puddle of paint like you're going to do a big flat wash, but you mix lots of white into it. You might need to layer it 2 or 3 times. If you're having trouble getting a flat wash behind your objects and you want a really, really flat background, then that's a way that you can do it. I'll put up 1 or 2 examples of my paintings now so you can see how it looks, and you get that lovely, lovely smooth consistency behind your still life or your floral object. It's a really interesting thing to do with your white paint. So the next technique I've got for you is splattering. So I've got a little bit of a painting here and I have done this sort of beach effect. So I've put 1 layer of fairly sort of mottled yellow paint on, mostly yellow ochre, and a bit of sort of mud from my palette, shall we say, to get a bit of colour variation. And then I splattered on top with a little bit of a darker colour, a little bit of sepia, and I got a bit of mottling to it. But a really subtle thing I can do is to now splatter on top with colour that's lighter. Now normally in watercolour you wouldn't be able to do this, and as I said, if you just put white paint on top of watercolour it's very noticeable, but to splatter like this very subtly and mix in with other colours can be really, really effective. So before I splatter I'm going to cover up the sky, and you'll see that I've actually torn the paper here, so I've got a torn edge. What you don't want is a cut edge, because it's really very noticeable where the splattering stops. So always tear. You can stick it down with a bit of masking tape if you want to. I'm not going to worry about that now. And then I'm going to get an old toothbrush like this one. These ones with a jagged edge are quite good. And all I'm going to do is get my white paint and mix a little bit of colour into it. So I'm going to go in with a bit of an orangey yellow, just to knock the pure white off of it. Mix it up like this. I'm going to get it so it's almost white, because if I do it too dark it just won't show up. And this is a technique that you want to work up in lots of layers actually. So this is good for beaches and also good for pathways. So I need to angle my paintbrush downwards, and I'm going to put my thumb underneath and pull backwards like this. Now if you have arthritis and you don't have flexible fingers like me, you can't do this. You can just point it down and then put a knife underneath and draw the knife backwards, and that will splatter for you. So you don't have to get your thumb underneath like this. And what I'm going to do now is splatter that paint. It's really, really very subtle. I can also, if I want to, if I'm going for this rough sort of beachy effect, I can pick up some paint on my toothbrush and dab directly on as well. And as I said, you want to do this in a few layers. I would also splatter with masking fluid when it was dry, so that I sort of pick out bits and pieces, and you can build up a real textured effect. I will do more of a longer tutorial on beaches and pathways, perhaps on a sort of sandy pathway through the woods, and we'll do some more of this technique. But as you can see, it's a really subtle way of using your white paint, so it doesn't look like it's pure white, but you get those little bits of light pebbles showing up in your beach or on your pathway. So the next occasion that I use white paint during watercolour painting is for items that actually have that kind of white opacity to them. Now there's two types of items that I see this. The first one is in fruits. If you imagine things like plums and figs, certain of those fruits have that real kind of soft white bloom to them. It's almost impossible to get if you just use pure watercolour. So I've done sort of a plum here, and what I'm going to do, I think it looks like a plum, I did it from memory to be honest. What I'm going to do is go back to my pure white paint and just put a bit of water in, and I can start to layer up and get that opacity across the top of the original painting. Now it may look very white when it goes on, but you'll find that as it dries it actually gets a lot less white. So you can get this kind of this lovely softness, this bloom that you get on certain fruits, and you can just build it up. You know, you can put more if you want to pick up more on one side, you can put more in one place, and then if you wanted perhaps less over this side here, you can just go back to pure water and spread across. Like anything else, you'll get a drying line if you just stop halfway across. So if you only want the bloom to be on part of the fruit, then just go across with clean water on the second part of it. As I said, it's a lot more noticeable when it's wet than when it's dry, so you may find you need to do this technique a few times and layer up until you get that lovely soft bloom to the fruit. Now the other occasion when I find that this is appropriate is for seashells. So if I show you, and rocks of course, if I show you some seashells here, you can see they have, you know, apart from the you know, the shiny parts, the colours of them, almost all seashells have this beautiful soft chalkiness to them, especially if they've been worn down a little bit. So here's one I've got here, and I've painted that one here, and you can see that I've got this sort of this lovely soft chalkiness to it, which I'm actually going to just go in with a bit of white paint, and we can start to get that. Remember that if there's any areas that you've painted dark, it'll cover those slightly, so if you don't want to kill those darks off completely, then just paint around them. But what I can do is I can start going in and getting as much of that soft chalkiness as I want. And often with seashells you want to go in with sort of with pure white paint, and without too much water, you know, you can get these lovely soft lines on them. And because it's watercolor paint, and gouache will behave the same, you can re-wet it. So if you paint it on like that and it looks a bit harsh, even after it's dry you can re-wet it. Now if you use acrylic or acrylic ink, you're not going to be able to re-wet, so just bear that in mind. It will only be water soluble while it's wet, but you don't have to buy any special paint. If you've already got some white paint, you can use anything really. But there is an advantage to these water soluble whites, to the gouache and to the white watercolor, which is that they will re-wet, and you can just keep painting and building up that softness. And can you see we've already got some real chalkiness going on there? And I'm probably going to paint this little bit that I left white. I'm probably going to put some of the white gouache on that because I want the matte here. I want to take away the shine. I want to get this real softness going on, and I can keep working onto this seashell until I get exactly the effect that I want. Do let me know in the comments if you'd like a full tutorial on painting seashells, because it really is one of my favourite subjects. So before we get on to the last technique for using white watercolour, can I ask you a favour? Could I ask you to click the like button? It's really helpful to me on YouTube, and it helps YouTube to see that it's a good video, and it pushes it out a little bit more and shows it to more people. So I'd be super grateful if you can click the like button, or even after you finish watching the video, if you can share it with people that might appreciate it too. So getting on to the last technique for using white paint, and the last technique is to use a dry brush technique to create fur or hair. Now I have done a full-length tutorial for that one already, so I'm not going to show you how to do it in this video. What I'm going to do is link to it in the end cards, and you can watch that one right now.